The fluorescent lights buzz overhead, casting a dull, cold glow over the cracked linoleum floors of a roadside diner just off Highway 71 in southern Ohio. The place smelled of burnt coffee, fried grease, and lemon-scented bleach. It was past 10 o'clock at night, and the few remaining customers sat hunched over their mugs or phones, half asleep, half bored. In the far back corner, Emily Carter dipped her mop into a gray bucket, wrung it out with aching hands, and continued working her way down the narrow aisle between booths. She was 23, small-framed, with tired eyes and hair pulled into a messy knot that had started falling apart halfway through her double shift. Her uniform, a red polo shirt and black apron, was soaked at the hem from earlier spills. The soles of her sneakers were worn thin. She didn't complain. She never did. Rick Thompson, the owner and manager, sat behind the counter, thumbing through receipts and occasionally barking orders to the lone cook in the back. He was a large man, with thinning gray hair and a voice like gravel. Everyone knew him. Most wished they didn't. Emily had just finished mopping around table 11 when the accident happened. The handle of the mop slipped from her hand, knocking over the bucket. A loud splash echoed through the diner as soapy water spread in a wide puddle across the floor. She froze. Time seemed to stretch. The few customers turned their heads. Rick stood up so fast his stool clattered behind the counter. "Jesus, Carter," he barked. "Are you serious right now?" I'm sorry," Emily stammered, already on her knees, trying to contain the mess with a dirty towel. Rick approached, his boots splashing through the puddle. He stood over her, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. Then, loud enough for everyone to hear, he laughed, a short, bitter laugh, and said, "You're only good for cleaning anyway." The words hung in the air. A couple near the window exchanged glances. One of the truckers at the bar shook his head. Emily kept her eyes down, lips pressed tight, scrubbing furiously as if she could erase what he'd said along with the mess. Her face flushed hot with shame. Rick walked off, muttering something about incompetence. No one came to her defense. No one ever did. But something in her shifted. That night, after closing, Emily walked the 3 blocks to her studio apartment, her wet socks squishing with each step. Her neighborhood was quiet, filled with worn brick buildings and flickering streetlights. Once inside, she dropped her bag by the door and peeled off her uniform. She didn't bother with dinner. Instead, she sat at the tiny kitchenette table, still in her undershirt and leggings, and pulled out her laptop, a 10-year-old model at Word, and wheezed each time it powered on. The screen flickered to life. Emily opened a document titled Untitled_Story_Draft 3 Docs and stared at the blinking cursor. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Rick's voice echoed in her head. "You're only good for cleaning anyway." Her jaw tightened. She began to type. Words came slowly at first. Fragments, sentences, half-formed thoughts. But within an hour, the floodgates opened. She wrote about a girl like her. Quiet, overlooked, stuck in a world that refused to see her value. But unlike real life, in this world, the girl's voice would be heard. Her thoughts would matter. Her story would matter. By the time the clock struck 2 in the morning, Emily had written over 2,000 words. She leaned back, stretched her fingers, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. The next morning, she woke up late, rushed through a cold shower, and made it to work just minutes before her shift began. Rick gave her a look but said nothing. That suited her fine. Throughout the day, between orders and cleaning tables, she scribbled notes on napkins and receipts, snippets of dialogue, scenes she wanted to explore. Even as Rick snapped at her or co-workers ignored her, Emily's mind remained elsewhere, in the world she was building, one word at a time. That night, as she mopped the floor again, she glanced at the bucket. The floor shimmered under the dim lights, but it wasn't just water anymore. It was something else. A reminder of that moment. A trigger. A promise. Rick's words had cut deep. But instead of breaking her, they had sparked something new. A fire. She wasn't just a cleaner. She was a writer, and she had a story to tell. The diner never changed. The same cracked leather booths, the same smell of burnt oil clinging to every corner, and the same fluorescent hum above. But something inside Emily had shifted. The floor still needed mopping. The order still needed filling. And Rick still found ways to belittle her under his breath. But her world had widened, even if no one else saw it. Most nights, after locking up, Emily returned to her cramped apartment and resumed the ritual she had unconsciously built. She would brew a cup of instant coffee, watery, bitter, and sit in silence while her laptop struggled to awaken. She no longer hesitated in front of the screen. Her fingers knew the way now. Every character she wrote felt like a small resistance against the narrow role the world had carved for her. The story grew steadily. It wasn't just fiction, it was survival. A girl abandoned by her family finds solace in forgotten books. A stranger walks into her life and shows her she matters. A place that once crushed her begins to listen. The narrative gave Emily a space to breathe, to hope, to reimagine. And every word reminded her that she still had something to say, even if no one had asked. On Sundays, her only day off, she often sat at the window with the curtains half drawn, editing pages while the sound of children playing echoed faintly through the alley below. She marked up the pages with a red pen she had stolen from the diner, her mind drifting between edits and unpaid bills. The gas had been turned off for a week. She was down to canned beans and peanut butter sandwiches. But she wrote. Sometimes she wondered what she was doing it for. Who would ever read this? Who would care? The fear crept in quietly. Late at night, like a draft through the cracked window frame, she'd stare at her ceiling in the dark, hands resting on her chest, and question everything. Maybe Rick was right. Maybe cleaning was the only thing she'd ever be good for. But then morning came, and she wrote again. A few weeks into her routine, she gathered the courage to print out the manuscript. It took nearly 2 hours at the library, feeding paper into the old machine, dodging looks from impatient patrons. She placed the printed pages into a cheap binder from the dollar store, labeled it in pen, The Quiet Light, with the manuscript finally finished, or as finished as it could be for now. Emily began researching publishers. She used the library computer during breaks, reading submission guidelines and formatting requirements. She found contests too, small ones, some with entry fees she couldn't afford. Still, she sent the manuscript to every open submission that didn't cost money. Rejections came quickly. Some were form letters, others offered a few polite sentences. Thank you, but not the right fit. One simply said, not compelling enough. Each rejection stung more than she wanted to admit. They piled up in her inbox, each subject line a tiny door closing. Then came the night her laptop died. It happened suddenly, just a soft pop, a fading screen, and silence. She sat motionless in the flickering kitchen light, staring at the black rectangle. No blinking cursor, no soft hum, no more story. For 3 days, she didn't write, not a single word. At work, she moved like a shadow. Rick's insults bounced off her like dull stones. She felt hollow, like the story inside her had been cut off mid-sentence. She feared she had lost it, that whatever had driven her to create had been snuffed out for good. But on the 4th day, something unexpected happened. An email. She had been checking her inbox out of habit, using her phone on borrowed Wi-Fi from the coffee shop across the street. Amid the sea of rejections, one message had a different tone. We'd love to discuss your manuscript. The email came from a small independent publisher based in Chicago. They hadn't just read her story, they had liked it. Emily stared at the screen for nearly 10 minutes before she believed it was real. The message was professional, clear, and cautious. The publisher wasn't offering a big advance or making any promises of bestseller lists, but they saw potential. They wanted to work with her, to help shape the book into something more. She called the number listed in the signature block that same afternoon. Her voice trembled as she introduced herself. On the other end, a woman named Lana spoke kindly, asked about the inspiration behind the story, and said something Emily would never forget. Your characters feel lived in, real, like they've been carrying secrets for years. Emily smiled for the first time in days. She agreed to the offer. There would be edits, deadlines, contracts to sign. It wasn't glamorous. There was no promise of a book tour or a spot in the front window of bookstores. But it was a start, and it was hers. That night, She sat at her kitchen table again, this time with printed pages spread across the surface. The laptop was gone, but the story was alive. She wrote in longhand now, a pen gliding across dollar store notebooks. The ink smudged, her fingers cramped, but she didn't stop. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window. Somewhere across the state, strangers were reading her words. Not many, not yet, but enough to matter. For the first time in her adult life, Emily felt something that had always seemed just out of reach. She felt seen. The first run of The Quiet Light was modest. 500 paperback copies with matte cover, printed through a local press in Chicago. There was no launch party, no press release, and no spot in airport bookstores. Just a box of books delivered to the publisher's office, and a quiet, almost sacred moment when Emily Carter held the first copy in her hands. She ran her fingers over the title, the texture of the paper, and her name printed in small, serifed letters beneath it. For a moment, she forgot how tired she was. The publisher, a lean operation of 3 women working out of a brick-walled office near West Loop, helped her craft a simple marketing plan. They created a website, set up a basic Instagram profile, and encouraged her to share the story behind the story, why she wrote it, what it meant to her. Emily, never one for social media, hesitated at first. Her life had always been private by necessity, wrapped in invisible threads of quiet struggle. But slowly, she began posting small updates, photos of handwritten drafts, and honest captions about writing between diner shifts. The first wave of readers came from unexpected places. A retired teacher in Oregon who emailed her to say the book made her cry. A college student in Michigan who posted a review on a book blog with just 6 followers. Emily replied to every message. She thanked them with sincerity. Her words weren't polished or rehearsed. They were real, like the pages she had written late at night in silence. Then came the post that changed everything. A well-known book influencer, someone with hundreds of thousands of followers, stumbled upon The Quiet Light through a mutual connection. She read it in one sitting, described it as a whisper that becomes a roar, and filmed an emotional review where she spoke about how the story reminded her of being invisible in her 20s. The video went viral. Within days, orders surged. The publisher scrambled to print more copies. Emails flooded in. Independent bookstores from Portland to Philadelphia asked for shipments. The book's Amazon ranking shot up, climbing past titles with full PR teams and publishing budgets 10 times the size. Emily watched it all unfold with surreal detachment. She still worked the morning shifts at the diner. Rick remained oblivious, unaware that the girl wiping tables next to the jukebox was now a rising voice in contemporary fiction. Customers who had ignored her for years now unknowingly discussed The Quiet Light while she refilled their coffee. She said nothing, kept her head down, and wrote their dialogue in her mind for future scenes. When the publisher invited her to a small literary event in Chicago, she almost declined. She couldn't afford a new outfit or the bus fare, but they insisted and covered the costs. She arrived with second-hand heels, borrowed earrings, and a nervous smile. She spoke on a panel with 2 other debut authors, her voice quiet but clear. Afterward, readers approached her with trembling voices and dog-eared copies of her book. They thanked her for writing the pain they couldn't name. One reader, a young woman with anxious eyes, said, "I read it in a laundromat while waiting for my clothes. I cried so hard I missed the dryer cycle. Thank you for making me feel less alone." Emily nodded, her throat tight. "Thank you for reading." More events followed. Podcasts, Zoom interviews, handwritten letters from prisons and shelters. One letter from a woman in Arkansas read, "I've never been in a book before, but now I feel like I was." Emily carried that letter folded in her wallet. 3 years after the book's quiet release, everything changed again. A call came from a Los Angeles area code. She let it go to voicemail, thinking it was spam, but when she listened later, her hands went cold. A film producer, young, enthusiastic, and heartfelt, had read The Quiet Light on a plane to New York. He called it a cinematic blueprint for the unseen and wanted to option the rights. Emily forwarded the message to her publisher, unsure of what any of it meant. Meetings followed, lawyers, contracts, a whirlwind of new vocabulary and cautious excitement. The deal was modest by Hollywood standards, but more than she had ever dreamed. The producer insisted Emily be involved. He valued her voice, her vision. She flew to Los Angeles for the first time in her life and sat in a studio office with walls lined with movie posters. The first draft of the script was promising. The actress cast as a protagonist had recently won an award for a dramatic role. The soundtrack included emerging artists whose lyrics echoed the themes of loneliness and renewal. Emily visited the set once during filming. She stood quietly by the monitors as the actress recited lines she had written in a cold apartment years ago, long before anyone had believed in her. The director turned to her at one point and said, "You wrote something honest. That's rare. People feel that." When filming wrapped, Emily returned home, choosing not to relocate or upgrade her life in drastic ways. She bought a better laptop, paid off her student loans, and moved into a slightly larger apartment with windows that opened properly. She kept her nights quiet, her routine steady. She still wrote by hand sometimes, just to remember. The premiere was scheduled for the following fall in New York City. The buzz had already begun. Trailers were trending. The soundtrack's lead single was climbing charts. The story, once scribbled on napkins and typed into a dying laptop, was now reaching screens around the world. Emily remained grounded, grateful, but not overwhelmed. Her story had grown beyond her, but its roots were still in that diner, in the silence between shifts and in the long nights when no one was watching. And now everyone was. The night of the premiere arrived with an unsettling stillness that hung over the streets of Manhattan like a breath held too long. As the black car wound its way through the city, Emily sat in the back seat, hands resting gently on her lap. The gown she wore was midnight blue, tailored with clean lines and a subtle shimmer that caught the city lights. Her hair had been styled into soft waves, and the makeup artist had insisted on a bold lip, something Emily would never have chosen herself, but now wore with unexpected grace. The driver turned onto the block where the theater stood, its marquee glowing beneath the wide canopy of camera flashes and velvet ropes. Crowds had gathered, some with signs, others with cameras, all pressing forward for a glimpse of the stars. The movie's lead actress had already arrived, her presence electrifying. The director followed, then the producer. Emily was next. A staff member opened her door and extended a hand, but she stepped out without assistance, the fabric of her dress brushing against her ankles. She blinked against the flashing lights, standing for a moment as the sound of voices filled the air. Reporters called her name, eager for a quote, a look, a comment. She posed briefly, more from instruction than instinct, and walked slowly down the carpet toward the theater entrance, pausing when asked, smiling when required. But her eyes kept scanning the crowd, as if searching for something or someone. She wasn't sure what made her turn at that moment. Perhaps it was a particular cadence of a voice she hadn't heard in years, or the slight break in the rhythmic chant of photographers shouting names. But there he was. Rick Thompson stood on the edge of the barricade, separated by a waist-high velvet rope and 2 layers of security. He looked different, older. The weight he once carried had slipped into a softer frame, and the harsh lines his face had deepened into weariness. He wore a wrinkled sport coat, far too warm for the evening, and clutched a dog-eared copy of The Quiet Light under one arm. He looked unsure, out of place, as if the moment had called him forward but left him stranded in it. "Emily!" he shouted. Tried to sound casual, his voice cracking over the noise. "Emily, hey, it's me." She turned fully now, the press noticing immediately. Cameras clicked, capturing her pause. Some reporters looked confused. Who was this man? An uncle? A fan? A forgotten name? Rick held up the book, gesturing toward her. "I read it," he said, forcing a laugh. "Amazing stuff. Really, I always knew you had something in you." He lifted his phone, angling it slightly. "Mind if we get a quick picture?" The absurdity of it all settled over her like fog. Emily didn't speak. She looked at him, really looked, and felt nothing sharp, no hatred, no bitterness. Just a strange, hollow recognition, like seeing a ghost who no longer had power to haunt. She gave him a polite, neutral smile. Then she turned back to the cameras and walked forward. A few murmurs followed behind her. She knew they would speculate, that the image of her looking at a man who once humiliated her in public would become a point of interest online. But she didn't care. There was nothing he could take from her anymore. Inside the theater, the atmosphere shifted. Velvet seats, golden lighting, hushed voices. She was guided to the front row alongside the cast and crew. The screen loomed large, ready to take the world into a story that had once lived only in her mind. As the lights dimmed, the audience quieted. A moment of total stillness passed before the first scene flickered to life. It was surreal. The actress, flawless, restrained, raw, breathed life into her protagonist with aching authenticity. Lines that Emily had once whispered to herself in a cramped kitchen now echoed through a room of strangers, all sitting in reverent silence. The audience laughed at the right moments, sighed when expected, and wept when the truth of the story hit too close. When the credits rolled, applause broke out. It started soft, then grew, swelling into a standing ovation that wrapped around her like a blanket. She stood, dazed, as the director motioned for her to take a bow. As she stepped forward, the applause became thunder. Flashbulbs popped. People whistled. Some shouted her name. After the film, the cast and crew gathered in a private lounge above the theater. Champagne flowed. Journalists mingled with producers. The room was alive with praise, predictions, and possibilities. Emily stood by a window, sipping from a glass, watching the city hum beneath her. The actress approached, taking a quiet moment away from the crowd. "You know," she said, "there's a line I couldn't get out of my head even after filming. That part where she says, 'You don't have to see me for me to exist.' That stayed with me." Emily smiled. "That one came out of nowhere. I wrote it without thinking." "Well, it changed me," the actress replied. "Just thought you should know." Later, back in her hotel room, the silence returned. She placed the award season gift bag on the desk without opening it and sat by the window. Her dress pulled around her feet. The city lights blinked below like distant stars. She thought of the diner, of bleach-stained floors and the smell of burnt bacon, of long nights and cold toes, of a version of herself that had once written to survive. She closed her eyes, not to escape it, but to honor it. The girl who had once been told she was only good for cleaning had now cleaned her soul of every lie they ever made her believe. And tonight, the world had watched her shine. The morning after the premiere, Emily sat alone at the small dining table in her hotel suite, barefoot and wrapped in a robe, sipping lukewarm coffee from a porcelain cup she hadn't finished brewing. The suite was silent, the kind of heavy silence that comes not from absence but from fullness, like the aftermath of a long-awaited rainstorm. The windows stretched from floor to ceiling, revealing the gray outline of New York's skyline blurred by early fog. Down below, taxis honked distantly, and people moved like flickering figures across intersections, unaware that a piece of someone's life had just come full circle above their heads. Her phone buzzed continuously. Messages from producers, interviews requests, congratulatory texts from names she didn't recognize, and dozens of tagged photos and quotes being shared across every social platform imaginable. She ignored most of them. She wasn't ready to return to the noise. The previous night had been transformative, not for its glamour, but for what it refused to erase. Standing on that red carpet, looking into the face of Rick Thompson, and choosing not to speak had taken more strength than any sentence she could have delivered. It wasn't triumph born from anger. It was a declaration of freedom. Her silence had not been empty. It had been deliberate, eloquent, a reply with no apology, no bitterness, a punctuation mark on a sentence she never wanted to finish writing. Now, sitting in her hotel room, she thought of how much that moment had said, without needing explanation. Rick's expression when she turned away wasn't just confusion. It was a slow, irreversible recognition that the narrative had shifted, that he no longer held the role he thought he did in her story. And that realization, left unspoken, had done more than any confrontation ever could. Later that morning, she walked down the hallway to the press suite, where she was scheduled to appear on a morning show. The network had arranged the interview days in advance, anticipating the film's reception. The makeup team touched up her face, a stylist adjusted the collar of her navy blouse, and the producer briefed her quickly. She nodded, polite but distracted. Her thoughts still hovered somewhere between the fog outside and the girl she had once been, mopping floors to quiet her own mind. The interviewer, a seasoned woman with sharp instincts and a warm smile, welcomed her on set. They exchanged pleasantries, the lights came up, and the segment began. Emily Carter, the host, said, "Congratulations. The film has officially opened to critical acclaim. The book is back on the bestseller list, and people are calling you the voice of quiet resilience. How does it feel?" Emily smiled softly, speaking calmly. "It feels surreal, honestly, but also steady. Like I've arrived at a place I was always walking toward, even when I didn't know it." The host leaned forward slightly. "Your story has resonated with so many people, not just because of the film, but because of how you began, working in a diner, writing between shifts. That kind of perseverance is rare. If you go back to those nights, alone, writing in silence, what would you tell yourself?" Emily paused, her eyes drifting slightly, as if recalling the worn edges of her kitchen table, the flickering screen of her old laptop, and the weight of loneliness that once sat beside her like a shadow. "I would say, keep writing, even if no one listens. Even if you think you're wasting your time. Because one day, your voice will be impossible to ignore." The room quieted. The crew, the host, even the air itself seemed to hold that answer with reverence. The interview continued, touching on the film's cast, her experience working with the director, the upcoming projects in development. But that one answer, clipped and true, will be the quote that headlines carried. It spread across platforms, printed in white text over stills from the film, shared in classrooms, libraries, and coffee shops. Strangers began to echo it as if it belonged to all of them now. And in a way, it did. That afternoon, she returned to the hotel, exhausted in the way only emotional closure can make someone. Her team had arranged a private car to take her to a book panel later that evening, but she canceled. She needed quiet, not the silence of pain, but the kind that feels like breath after holding it too long. She sat once again at her table, this time with a clean notebook and a pen that glided effortlessly across the page. Not for anyone else, not for a deadline, just for her. She began writing something new, a different story, not autobiographical, not confessional, something imagined, something wild and tender and free. The kind of story she used to think she wasn't allowed to write because no one had given her permission. Now she knew better. Hours passed. The sun dipped behind the skyline, casting long shadows through the windows. She turned on a lamp, the yellow light warming the space around her. Outside, the city continued its endless rhythm, but inside, time softened. She thought of all the women who would read her words, women who had once been told they were only good for something small, something quiet, something invisible. She wrote for them now, not to save them, but to remind them they were never broken to begin with. That night, as she crawled into bed, the phone continued buzzing across the room. She left it untouched. She needed nothing from it. The world could wait. For the first time, she wasn't chasing the story. She was becoming it.